Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're taking you back to Hollywood's golden age, but we're not just here for the glitz and glamour, are we?
Not at all.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but we want to go deeper. This is more than just, looking at the pretty faces and the fancy clothes.
Right, right. It's easy to get swept up in the romance of it all, but
Yeah.
like all things, Hollywood in this era, it's more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Exactly. So we're going to dig into the forces that really shaped this era, the good, the bad, the downright dramatic. And speaking of dramatic, we got to start with the elephant, or should I say, the lion, in the room. The 1920s, the silence, they were on their way out. And then in 1927, the jazz singer hits the screens. Al Jolson belts out, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. And bam, everything changes.
Talk about a game changer. It wasn't just a new technology.
Yeah.
It completely transformed the way stories were told. Sound. Suddenly you've got this whole other dimension to play with.
I can't even imagine being a filmmaker at that time. It's like the Wild West of sound. You're having to rethink everything. But it wasn't just the creative side. Think about the business, the studios. They had their eyes on the global prize, right? They wanted to conquer the world with Hollywood films.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you do that when suddenly your dialogue is locking you into specific languages?
And that's where dubbing comes in,
Yeah.
right? It's fascinating. You've got these separate audio tracks, painstakingly created, then matched to the film as a whole new level of, well, headache to the process.
It's mind-boggling, and you can see how quickly they adapted.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the sources we looked at talked about this Spanish film, Santa, from 1932. It was one of the first to use dubbing extensively. Speaks volumes about how studios were already adjusting to the demand for global cinema.
Exactly. They had to adapt or die. And it's amazing how quickly they did.
But just as Hollywood found its voice, literally the world throws a curveball, the Great Depression. Now, you'd think people would cut back on things like going to the movies, but here's where it gets interesting.
It's counterintuitive.
Right.
But actually, attendance at movie theaters, it surged during those early years of the Depression. People needed an escape.
Makes sense. When times are tough, who doesn't want to get lost in another world for a couple of hours?
Exactly. And when it came to providing that escape, nobody did it quite like the big five studios. MGM, Paramount, Warner Bros., 20th Century Fox, and RKO. These weren't just studios, they were empires, each with its own distinct flavor, its own stable of stars.
It's true, like MGM had that touch of class, the big budget musicals, the elegance.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And Warner Bros., gritty, real, not afraid to tackle tough subjects.
Paramount, always the sophisticated ones, the masters of witty banter and, those comedies that just make you feel good.
And then you've got 20th Century Fox, those grand epics, sweeping you away to different times and places. Don't forget RKO. They might have been the little guy of the big five, but they gave us King Kong and Citizen Kane.
Two of the most iconic films ever made.
Exactly. But here's the thing to remember. These studios, they weren't just making movies. They were controlling the whole game. From discovering talent to producing those films to getting them into theaters, they even owned the theaters. It was a system, completely vertically integrated.
Talk about a monopoly, huh? And for a while, it worked. But like we said, at Depression, it had a way of catching up even with Hollywood. By 1931, most studios were struggling. Except, it seemed, for MGM. They weathered the storm a little better than the rest. Makes you wonder, what was their secret?
Well, and this is where things get really interesting, right? Because the government, realizing how important Hollywood was not just culturally, but economically, well, they decided to step in. They offered these lifelines to the studios who were struggling.
It was a bailout. But like all bailouts, not everyone was thrilled about it. Some argued it was giving the studios even more power, and honestly, it's hard to argue with that.
Right. I mean, talk about unintended consequences. But it did help to keep Hollywood afloat, and it allowed them to continue making those big, splashy pictures that we now associate with the Golden Age. And, I mean, is there a more iconic example of that than The Wizard of Oz?
You're right. The Wizard of Oz, it's practically a textbook example of Golden Age filmmaking, if you ask me.
Absolutely. You've got the amazing sets, that Technicolor, bringing the Land of Oz to life,
Right.
and, of course, Judy Garland.
Already a star, but this film...
Oh, this cemented her as a legend.
And it was based on a book, right? So they had that built-in audience, people who already loved the story.
Smart move for the studio.
Yeah. But here's the thing, and this always blows my mind. The Wizard of Oz, it wasn't actually a hit right away.
Really? I did not realize that.
I know, right? For a film that's so, ingrained in our culture, so iconic, it actually lost money at first. Imagine that.
Wow, the studio heads must have been sweating.
I know. Talk about a gamble, right?
Yeah,
Putting all that money, that creativity into something, and it doesn't connect with audiences right away.
it's a good thing I stuck with it, though. I mean, can you imagine a world without the Wizard of Oz?
I can't. But it does make you think about the risks they were willing to take back then. Those big, expensive films, they were really going for it. But that ambition, it also led to some pushback, especially when it came to what was considered acceptable to show on screen.
Right, we can't talk about the Golden Age without talking about censorship, the Hays Code.
I mean, some of those rules were, well, let's just say they were a sign of the times. No excessive and lustful kissing. Can you believe that?
Try telling that to Clark Gable.
You know, right? It seems so quaint now, almost sweet in a way. But obviously, at the time, it had a huge impact on the types of stories that were being told.
And the way they were told, too. Filmmakers, they had to get creative, find ways to work around those restrictions. It's fascinating.
It's true. And I've always thought that those limitations, they actually forced them to be even more inventive. Like, that's where we get those classic screwball comedies from, right? Fast-talking, witty, full of innuendo, because they couldn't just come right out and say what they meant.
Absolutely. It's a masterclass in subtext, in using suggestion and nuance to get your point across. And you're right, it's hilarious. But just as Hollywood was figuring out how to push the envelope without getting censored, the world throws another much bigger curveball. World War II.
Everything changes. Suddenly, escapism, it's not enough anymore. The world is a different place, a scarier place, and Hollywood, they have to reflect that.
War films became incredibly popular, showcasing American heroism, sending a message.
Propaganda, basically.
In some cases, sure. But it also reflects the reality of the times, the anxieties, the hopes. It's complicated.
It is. And back home, while the war is raging, America itself is changing. The suburbs are booming. People are leaving the cities in droves, heading for those little houses with white picket fences.
It's the American dream in action. But it also means that fewer people are going to those grand old movie palaces.
Their audience was literally moving away.
A challenge for sure. But Hollywood, they've always been adaptable, haven't they?
And how do they adapt? The drive-in, perfect for those sprawling suburbs?
It's brilliant, really, bringing the movies to the people right in their cars. Who needs a babysitter when you can take the whole family? But even the drive-in, it couldn't prepare them for what was coming next.
Oh, that flickering light in the corner of the living room. The television.
Now, this wasn't just some passing fad, like, oh, remember smell-o-vision.
Or those 3D glasses everyone thought would change everything.
Exactly. Television, this was different. This was a game changer, bringing entertainment right into your home. And once you got past the cost of that TV set, it was free.
You gotta think, the studio execs, they were sweating bullets. But maybe they were in denial. Like, nah, it'll blow over. It's just radio with pictures.
They dealt with radio, right? Those audio dramas, they were all the rage at one point.
But TV, it was both, wasn't it? The intimacy of radio, but with the visual storytelling power of film?
Exactly. A potent combination. And the studios, well, they kind of missed the boat at first. Didn't fully grasp how powerful that combination could be.
Instead of embracing it, they went on the defensive, right? And what's the best defense? Go big or go home? Thus, widescreen was born. CinemaScope, VistaVision, all these formats designed to make you feel like you were really in the movie, something you just couldn't get at home.
Although, not everyone was sold on widescreen.
Oh, I know, right? Like, some folks thought it was just a gimmick.
Well, the legendary producer Samuel Goldwyn, he supposedly said, widescreen just makes a bad film twice as bad.
He had a point. But hey, you gotta try new things, right? And besides, it wasn't just about the size of the screen, was it? The world was changing in much bigger ways. The Cold War, McCarthyism, that whole era cast a shadow over everything, even Hollywood.
It was a dark time. The blacklist, all those artists, writers, directors, blacklisted, their careers destroyed just for their beliefs.
It's chilling, and it really stifled creativity in Hollywood. Suddenly, studios were terrified of taking risks, of making anything that might be considered remotely controversial.
Talk about a chilling effect.
Yeah.
And it's ironic, isn't it? We were just talking about how the government bailed out Hollywood during the Depression, and now here they are again, but this time, they're the ones putting the pressure on.
And that pressure, it eventually leads to the final blow against the studio system, United States v. Paramount, a landmark case.
The government, they argued that the studios, with their control over everything, production, distribution, exhibition, it was an illegal monopoly.
And they won. Studios were forced to sell off their theater chains, breaking up that iron grip they had on the industry.
It marked the end of an era, really. The old studio system, it was over. And it wasn't just happening in Hollywood, was it?
Hmm.
Europe, after the war, they saw this resurgence of filmmaking.
New voices, new perspectives. The world was hungry for something different. And Hollywood, they weren't the only game in town anymore.
It's like this perfect storm. You've got television changing how people consume entertainment. You've got political pressures, censorship. You've got the government stepping in, breaking up the monopolies, and you've got international competition. It's no wonder the golden age came to an end.
But what's amazing to me is how much it still resonates, right? I mean, we still talk about the power of Hollywood, even though that system is long gone. What do you think it is about this era that continues to fascinate us?
Well, I think it's the stories they told, the stars they created, the way they captured our imaginations. The golden age, it perfected a certain kind of magic, a way of transporting us to other worlds, making us believe in the impossible. And that magic, it lingers, doesn't it? Think about the films we celebrate today, the actors we idolize, even the way we talk about movies. It's all got the DNA of that era in it.
It's true. They really knew how to put on a show. And that's it for this deep dive into Hollywood's golden age. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.